Justice Tech Pros here. I'm excited for today's episode. I arranged to have guest speaker Andrew Garrett on from Garrett Discovery. We wanted to dive into cell site technology. I've spoken to Andrew about it in the past, and he really enlightened me onto the science behind it, or should I say the junk science behind it, and I want him to elaborate on that. I've used Andrew for several cases, and his services, in my opinion, they should be mandatory for defense teams whenever one is dealing with a supposed science affecting their case. And his firm offers computer, mobile, video, and audio forensic experts and examinations. And that could be applied to all phases of a trial and of an indictment, whereas you could utilize various experts to come in where it relates to the motion portion, and then eventually the trial, and then if you go to the appeal, if unfortunately you don't get the results you were aiming for and your client is convicted incorrectly. So I have used Andrew, and I'm continuing to use Andrew on the appeal phase on a specific case right now, whereas I needed his services to verify an audio tape. I touched on this where the prosecution, the government was trying to say that a specific tape was referencing our client, and when in reality it wasn't. The words that they were trying to state were inaccurate, and the defense team knew they were inaccurate, so we need an expert to confirm that and enhance the audio to prove that. And it's just vital, as I've touched on in many episodes, it's just vital when you're building your defense and you're strategizing to make certain that you're prepared with your own experts to oppose studies and to oppose forensics that the other side, the state or the government or the prosecutor may introduce. And it's very important for the jury to see both sides, and it's also very important even during the motion phase. You could attach and get affidavits to confirm what you're putting in for a motion to fight maybe admittance of supposed discovery, supposed evidence. If it's not accurate and it's not what the government is painting it to be, it's important to have an expert to back up what the defense counsel is trying to explain. So to me, his service is invaluable, and it's necessary to have a proper defense and to make certain that your client is getting the most comprehensive and capable defense possible. And it's a matter of, really going through the discovery, as I discussed, pulling out things that could be interpreted or could be a negative for your case, and you need to analyze them and understand them, because you may be able to switch that around and prove that it's not as ironclad or as accurate as the government and the U.S. attorney or the prosecutor and the state wants the jury to believe, or even wants the court or the judge to believe. So it's very important that you get all those things lined up as you're building your case and really understand what experts you may need come down the road as you start putting things together. And today we're going to specifically focus on cell site. That was a big part of the last case I was involved in. And the government was making it so matter of fact, and they were really relying that. And I truly feel that that weighed heavily on the jury. And the defense, it didn't affect our client, but it affected the co-defendants, and the defense really needed to have an oppositional expert to refute the claims. And I think it's a necessary strategy and a necessary part of the process. So we're going to be speaking with Andrew, and I'm looking forward to that conversation. I believe it's going to be very informative for the listeners. I think it's going to be very informative for myself, just to further expand on it. And I also believe, even defense counsel listening, and even defendants that may be listening, it'll just open their eyes a little bit of what to possibly focus on and inquire about. So with that said, let me introduce Andrew, and we'll begin our conversation. Andrew, how are you? Thanks for chatting today.
Doing great, doing great.
I just wanted to, I wanted to have a dialogue today. I wanted to talk about it on the past episodes of the podcast. I was talking about how a lot of these different sciences aren't as matter of fact as the other side, the government, the state, or the prosecutor leads the jurors or even the court to believe. So I wanted to really dive in today to the sell side aspect of it, because I was approached with it in, the last case, and we spoke about it in the past, and I saw the kind of damage it could do when the defense does not put on an oppositional expert to kind of expose and go into the details of the cell site from the defense perspective, and the jury only hears the prosecutor side. So I figured that would be what we kind of touch on today.
Sounds good.
One of the initial things I wanted to ask you, which I believe would be beneficial, is how is the training on the law enforcement side when they come in and they're learning about the technology? How does that angle work? What are their requirements? What do they have to do to really learn that technology?
I think to help your listeners out to understand, the trust of what I'm about to say and to know the validity of it, they probably need to understand a little bit about my background. And you want, I'll go through that in about 60 seconds here. I worked U.S. Navy and then Navy Reserve. I was assigned to Naval Research Laboratory at NASA. I worked in geospatial. I worked for a tower engineering crew before. I ran the Illinois Wireless Information Network for the state of Illinois. I was one of the people that managed that. I tested software for space and warfare, penetration testing for the Navy satellite communications network. I was also vice president of a GPS company that built and designed GPS software to track people on their mobile phones. And then I ran the e-discovery and forensics laboratory at Scott Air Force Base. I spoke as a keynote speaker at Telecommunications and Internet Association, which is TTIA, on location-based services. Member of the FBI InfraGard, 10 Criminal Defense Lawyers Associations. I'm also the president of Digital Forensic Community, and I've testified between reports, oral testimony in depositions, hearings, and by report over 215 times in 13 states, and been certified as an expert in over 13 states. That number's changed a lot. I'm looking at an old slide from a year and a half ago or so. But
yeah, I'm sure that's grown.
yeah, it grows daily. But and like this morning, featured front page Fox News Business talking about the whole iPhone situation with Bill Barr and how they're spinning something out there that's not correct.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw that. I saw that article, and that's going to be the latest hot topic, I'm sure, in the news.
Oh, it is. So here's basically kind of what's happened is there's a junk science. It's using call detail records to determine the location of somebody with any accuracy is just not possible. It's not rooted in science. What it is it's a alleged science that law enforcement came up with years and years ago, and then they decided to build their own training schools, their own classes around it. Then former law enforcement officers built their own software companies, and the companies that are doing the mapping of this stuff are all former law enforcement. I don't know anybody that's not former law enforcement. They basically took a bad science and created an industry out of it, and I think it'd probably be best if we get into kind of how it's done.
Absolutely.
How does law enforcement do what they do? And basically what goes on is when you make a phone call, your telephone, mobile phone, has a billing record associated with it. The reason it has to have a billing record that has what cell phone tower you use is because the cell phone towers, most of them aren't owned by the cell phone company. They're leased. It's an antenna that they're leasing, or they're leasing the physical structure and they're putting their own antenna on it, and they get charged per phone call.
Gotcha.
So many years ago, there was a thing called a joint interoperability agreement. And this interoperability agreement was between cell phone carriers. So when you were traveling along on AT&T and you wanted to roam on T-Mobile's network, you could do so, which gave you better cell phone coverage. So a lot of people signed agreements. And basically the big five, we call them mobile network operators, signed agreements, and then everybody underneath them is what we call a mobile virtual network operator. There's about 320 of those that are the Cricket Wireless and companies like that actually own nothing. They're just a reseller of somebody else's service is what they are. They're a label on a network.
I see.
So what they did is you have a billing record. So you buy a cell phone store, you go to Walmart, you buy yourself even a prepaid phone. You go out, you activate it, and then it activates for a certain tower, and that tower becomes what you call your home tower record. And now all your billing is tied to that home tower record in what you call your billing center. So when you travel from, let's say you activated it in Chicago, but you travel to LA. So the LA network you try to connect to says, is this person able to make a phone call? So it checks this national registry and says, yeah, you can make a phone call because the national registry says you're a good guy and you paid your bill. So after that, it lets you make the phone call. It gives you credit. It says, okay, you paid your bill, or you're not delinquent, your phone's not shut off, we're going to let you make a phone call.
It's almost like an approval process.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of approval process, and then you make a phone call. And after you make your phone call, at the end of the month, end of the week, end of the day, depends on what kind of tower it is and where it's at, it bills your home tower record. So it says, you, Andrew Garrett, was using tower number 111222 in Los Angeles at this time and this date for this many seconds. But that's where CDR records come from. That's really what we call detail record, or call detail records, or called data records. Sometimes people call it data. Basically, is a function of billing. It has nothing to do with location.
Wow, that's incredible.
There is other records,
and yet they put it off in a different way. That's incredible.
Yeah, there's it goes a little beyond that. It goes. So what you do is, if you ask me the question of, can I say that somebody was in the area of one tower and moved to an area of another tower and they're geographically 50 miles apart, the answer is yes. I can answer that question because I can see that you build on one tower and build on another. But there's all kinds of funny stuff that happens when towers are next to each other. You've got trunking, you've got banding issues. So a banding issue is, for instance, a tower may be a 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G tower, and each one of those G's per se is different technology, and it has a different footprint. It broadcasts differently. So you may be able to be 10 miles from the tower on one technology, but only be 3 miles from the tower on another technology, but your call detail record doesn't answer that question. It tells you you're on that tower. It doesn't tell you which technology you're using, which changes what we call the radio frequency footprint. They call them RF propagation maps, what they call them. That's the technical term for cell phone providers. When they go in the field and they test the coverage, they build these things called RF propagation.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of like how this all started, was billing. And if you notice now, when the call detail records are delivered to the police department, when they issue a subpoena for these records, at the very bottom, that often gets whited out, it says these records are not to be used to determine location.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail right on the head with getting whited out, because a lot of times that's missing when the defense gets it as part of the discovery.
Yep, all the time. Or they get only part of it cut and pasted out in a report, and they don't actually get the source data.
Right. Yeah. Well, what they'll do a lot of times too is turn over an Excel spreadsheet, which would be populated on the government's end. They'll turn over the Excel spreadsheet with all the figures dumped into there, so it's not the original printout or the original report.
So what do we? As a defense firm, there's ways to counter this. There's multiple ways you can counter this. Some of it is somewhat embarrassing to the government for what they're doing and how they're using this data. But this data is useful. It's just not useful for what they're trying to use it for. There's urban planning. There's the CDC uses it to determine how many people they could move out of the city if there was an outbreak of like Ebola. So they use that data they get from the cell phone carriers to determine how long it would take to move people in an emergency from one area to another.
Gotcha.
And it's good for that because you can make some estimations, right? You could do some calculations and some estimations. But to say that Bob Jones is standing on the corner of 6th and Main Avenue, that's just not possible. Not using CDR records. There are other records that can get you more detail of where somebody's located at, like what we call PCMD and NELOS records. But those records have a short shelf life. They only get kept around, a week, week and a half, 2 weeks sometimes. And the reason is that is used to determine the health of the cell network, and the carrier only needs it for a short amount of time. So their need is very, very short, and it's a lot of data. So they don't want to keep it around forever. They would have a real storage problem. And so if somebody gets murdered today and the FBI needs to know about the cell phone record of this person, they could dump out those NELOS and per call management records, and they could get that stuff very, very quickly and within a couple of days, and then they can continue monitoring that on a day-to-day basis if they're trying to track or find something. But if it's 2 weeks out, or oftentimes when somebody's trying to defend these cases, you're talking years later,
right.
6 months, 2 years later, those records are gone.
So is that why then they default to the CDR? Is that what, do they almost try to use that as a replacement and try to give it a little more validity than it actually has?
I think what it is it's in a lot of cases I see, this is the only thing that places the suspect at, they allege this is the only thing that would place them at the crime scene. They may have nothing else. This may be the only thing. The problem is you have a cell phone tower, it may have a footprint of 20 square miles, and I hear this language all the time used in court that, John Doe was most likely located at the corner of this and corner of that. And I'm like, based on what? The footprint's 20 miles. He could have been of one of 6,000 houses, 1,100 businesses, and 4,000 toilets at the time. I mean, you name it, he could have been anywhere, right? I mean, they can't pin him there. They could just say he's in the area. And not only that, most of the time they could say he's northeast of the tower somewhere. And they can't even answer that, because let me tell you why. And this happens all the time when I testify in court, is you can put the government expert on the witness stand, and they come out with their pretty little cones, and they say the antenna broadcasts in this direction, and here's the beam width, and here's the distance it broadcasts. And then we go in the field and test, and we're a quarter mile, half mile, 3 miles, 2 miles, whatever it is, outside that cone, and we take measurements and say, I can make a phone call right here, and we make a phone call. And we pull our own phone records, and it shows what cell phone tower we were using. And you put their expert in the witness stand, and you say, can you make a call from right there? And their answer every time is no. And it's a dauber issue at that point. They're not an expert, because they never went in the field. They didn't test. They didn't do any scientific basis for anything, any scientific tests for anything they did. They're simply relying on the cell phone carrier's data to say somebody is at a certain location. And as soon as they do that, we go, well, we were able to test and make phone calls there, so your data is not accurate. Problem is they don't go in the field to test. It's expensive. It takes time. You have to buy units like what we call a BTS tracker by SecureCube, or you buy something like a JDSU unit, which actually goes out and tests the cell phone network. This is what, if you ever run into one of these guys from like Verizon Wireless, got a Verizon backpack with a couple antennas hanging out of it, and they're running around a sports stadium or they're running around a parking garage with this thing, that's what they have in their backpack. They have a JDSU unit, and they are testing the network for its network health, see whether or not they can get coverage or not.
I see.
That is the actual unit that tests it, and it creates these things called RF propagation maps, and we'll get into that here in a minute. But the answer is there's ways to test it, and there's ways to counter what they're saying really easily by showing that their footprint, their analysis is not correct. But then again, it's an easy win for them if nobody challenges.
Yeah, that's the problem I see. I mean, you summed it up right there. That's the problem. If they get on and they paint it only one way and there's no opposition to that, the jurors, just by human nature, they get enamored with a quote-unquote expert, So if there's nothing to challenge that or nothing to show the other side or the reality of it, that's where the problem is. And I see far too many times defense teams where they're not putting on an oppositional expert, and they don't realize the damage that it's doing by not doing that.
So sometimes it comes. The reason I think that sometimes defense experts aren't hired is, one, it's costly.
Yes.
And it's costly because it's a science. You don't go get a DNA test done without a DNA lab that costs millions and millions of dollars, and if they didn't test, if they didn't run DNA on 5,000 people a month, then they couldn't make any money. Well, forensic experts aren't doing 5,000 cases a month. You're getting one person that does, a dozen cases a month, and they're buying these very expensive tools. Some of these tools are $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. In our laboratory alone, we have about $2.2 million worth of equipment. That's not cheap. And some of these tools you only use twice a month. But you need them for the cases you're working on, but you're up against the FBI and the state police and local law enforcement that have unlimited budgets sometimes, especially when it comes to cases involving murder and things like that. They have this unlimited balloon of money that they just draw down from, and because the taxpayers are paying the bill. Well, the taxpayers aren't paying the forensic expert's bill. It's usually some guy that's being charged that has no money at all. And the defense team just is either public defenders or they just don't have the money to do this.
Well, let me ask you on that note, if they are a public defender, have you encountered that where they tried to get your firm approved and were pretty much knocked down? Because I know a lot of times that is the problem where the defense, they're using a CGA, they're using a public defender, and they try to get their own defense witness, which they're entitled to, and it's actually knocked down. They're not approved for it. I mean, have you encountered that as well?
I haven't. I think there's a fear of getting shot down or something like that because most of the time it's $2,500 or $5,000. It's usually the limit for an expert. It's really hard for $2,500 to travel across the United States, go out, do some testing in the field, and then write an expert report, and then on top of that, go testify. I mean,
absolutely,
it doesn't add up.
Right?
You couldn't get through the travel logistics and
no, it would cost you money.
Yeah, you would lose dearly. But if the case is local to the expert, it's something they could pick up. But what you'll find from most experts is they don't work in their backyard. The reason they don't is you don't make friends doing this. Because,
I can imagine.
Unfortunately, law enforcement doesn't like getting told they're wrong, right?
Right.
And they would love it. They would love it if the world was just. Now, I find the FBI to be completely fair most of the times. Most of the time, FBI agents and the investigators there, if you come to the table and you show them where they're wrong, they will concede.
Sure.
They will walk away right then and there. But I can't say the same, at least my experience of other law enforcement entities, they're not going to walk away. They'll double down.
Right.
And when they double down, it's more of an embarrassment. So I've had many cases where the FBI CAS unit showed up, cellular analysis unit. I've testified or I filed a report last minute, and they walked away.
Right.
They simply left. I had a murder case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I went. We brought it up before the judge. We said, look, you haven't seated the jury. We have something to bring up to you, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. I had a gal charged with murder that they had a cell phone of hers and her deceased husband and said they were both together, and she called his voicemail. Okay.
Right. And
the location they put the phone at, I'm looking at, and I says, look, if you want to prove that she was somewhere else or something else, I need to go in the field and test it. So I told the law firm I was working for. So I went there, went to Milwaukee, went out in the field, looked at the tower, and the tower looked shiny chrome almost. It's brand new. And I go, well, this is interesting. I got a brand new cell phone tower here. So I asked the business that's sitting next to it, and they says, there hasn't been a cell phone tower there. That thing's 6 months old. Pretty new. And I said, well, this is from 2 years ago. So I called the 800 number in the tower. I had the Network Operations Center dispatch me out a network engineer. I told him I had a problem at the tower. Well, the problem was me. Nobody else.
Right.
So they sent out a network engineer. Usually these network engineers are located within 30 miles of all the towers they work on. They have like a geographical range, and they drive around these trucks that have the Verizon logo on the side or whatever they do, and they got a bunch of equipment back. Now, you're thinking, well, just Verizon. I'm not picking on Verizon, but Verizon also offers their repair services to other cell phone carriers. So they may actually manage like the whole tower, but there may be other carriers in the same tower. They're just the engineering crew that works in the tower.
I see.
So I have this engineer show up. His name's Mark. And I'm talking to Mark, and I says, hey, do you have an RF propagation map for this tower? He says, sure. Pull it up. And I says, do you have it from 2015, July? He goes, yeah. He goes, matter of fact, I got that subpoenaed one. Well, that's kind of funny because I've never seen it.
Right.
And we're about to go to trial in 3 days. So I get this map, and he prints it off to me, and then he gives me the email sending it to the subpoena compliance department of T-Mobile. So we get to trial, and we don't have this map. T-Mobile never provided to law enforcement. Law enforcement wrote the reports off the CDR data they got from T-Mobile, but they did not provide the RF propagation map. The RF propagation map has a big old black hole right in the middle where they say the cell phone was at, which is a rock quarry, which is 305 feet underground and has no line of sight with the tower. Not only that, the CDR data they were using was based off a cell phone tower that didn't even exist. That tower number didn't even exist at the time of the murder.
Wow.
That's how horrible this was. So we take it up. I could say they probably weren't happy with their engineer for handing me all that data,
Yeah.
but I get told exactly why they didn't give it to the FBI. It's real simple, because if the public knew what the actual cell footprint is for coverage, they would be suing them for advertising falsely about their coverage area.
Incredible.
So you don't want to share out the engineering maps, and I say these are the maps of testing the network, that says they don't have cell phone coverage in a small little town, but they're selling people in that town cell phone. So there's a bad problem in the cell industry where they start selling cell phones in areas where they don't have cell phone service, and they put what these things called cows. It's a cell on wheels. They'll put one up locally. They give really horrible service. They'll sell cell phones there, and then when they get enough subscribers, they'll go build a tower.
Huh.
But they'll stand up a store in an area that they have zero coverage in on purpose. So their maps, as Verizon shows, it's painted all red for the entire United States almost.
Right.
And you and I know how many times we've driven out in the middle of the country, there's no cell phone service.
Yeah, it's all about the marketing. All about the marketing.
About the marketing.
Yep.
So in order to keep their secret, they do not share those maps. That's a problem.
Yeah,
So
and that's the
what
danger of it. I mean, you have people's lives on the line where they're trying to use this data, and then you have a marketing aspect that's actually affecting the accuracy. I mean, how crazy is that when you think about it, right?
What's real crazy is T-Mobile's subpoena compliance department got a copy of that map, and they didn't give it to the FBI when they got requested to give it to it. Instead, they provided CDR data. Here's the problem with CDR data. This is where it all sums up. This is kind of like where everything collapses into one frame. The call detail records have the phone number you called, what cell phone tower you started on, what cell phone tower you ended on. And from those cell phone towers, it tells you the direction of the antenna on the tower, because some towers have 3 and 6 cells. They have multiple antennas. It's basically like a pie-shaped wedge. They're saying, this is the pie piece. Here's the azimuth. Here's the beam width. And here's the distance it broadcasts. That data is based off of the FCC application to build the tower. Let me repeat that. The FCC application to build the tower. That is not even. That's equivalent as me saying, I know for a fact, scientifically, I can stand on the witness stand, raise my hand and say, a Corvette can go 145 miles an hour, and it's stable because I read the brochure.
Right.
Well, what scientific basis do I have to make anything from a brochure? I'm not the engineer. I didn't design the thing. I didn't test it. So what you're doing is you're taking an FCC application. And now the FCC application, the reason it has distance it broadcasts, the signal, is for what you call deconfliction purposes. So if somebody says some signal's interfering with my two-way radio tower, they know what other signals broadcast far enough to reach that. That doesn't mean you can make a phone call there. It just means the signal, the furthest distance the signal can be measured at, that's measurable, is that distance. So none of that is correct. If you look at an RF propagation map versus those cones, they look nothing like each other. An RF propagation map looks like a booger squished on a piece of paper. It looks like something out of Ghostbusters. It's this crazy, funny pattern-looking thing. It looks like one of those Venn diagrams, or whatever they call it.
Right.
Yeah, it looks pretty ugly. It's definitely not a cone, and it's not a circle. It's like a couple circles all smushed together on block paper, right? So that's what it basically boils down to, is you've got the government using a specification before a tower is built as being accurate and factual, when in all reality, a lot of times those towers are built, they're 3 or 4 degrees off, they only broadcast 2/3 the way they said they were going to broadcast to, because it's just an application to the FCC. The FCC has no information for after the tower's built as far as the mobile network operator testing the tower. So they don't go back to the FCC and say, now that the tower's built, here's the actual specs of what it's doing. They don't do that.
So now when they have these experts come in for the state side or the government side, when they're putting up their PowerPoints and they're putting up their spreadsheets and they're putting up their data, it's pretty much just based on, like you were saying, to equate it to brochure information. I mean, it's not really based on actual testing and actual information or data that supports it, correct?
Correct. So if you take a look at, there's a case, U.S. versus Antonio Evans out of the Seventh Circuit. This got brought up. We says, hey, we've got a problem here. This is not based on any scientific data whatsoever. Nobody tested this network. You're basing it off of the specification. And in that case, the Northern District of Illinois ruled that granulization as a theory can no longer be used.
So they pretty much ruled that it is a junk science.
It ruled that it's a junk science. And they're not the only court that's ruled that. The problem is you have to have somebody like me that goes to court to explain this to the court. Otherwise, this stuff sounds pretty sexy, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Somebody comes in, they come up with these pie charts, they do all this stuff on Microsoft Maps, and they show you all this information. They give you a picture of the tower. They talk about cell phone technologies and all this stuff, and it sounds great, right? It sounds like a science.
Right.
Like all this technical mumbo-jumbo. At the end of the day, I'm like, have you ever seen the tower? Did you ever go look at it? Did you ever go test it? Did you ever measure it? They go, no, we relied exactly on the CDR data. Well, you know where that CDR data actually came from? They don't know.
Right.
And a lot of law enforcement will say they don't know. Now, I've been to some forensic conferences over the last couple of years, and I've had the companies stand in front of me that sell software that plot the location of somebody based on cell phone towers. And they say, here's the pie shape, and they could be anywhere in this pie, right? And they've admitted in front of everybody that this is just to be used to do kind of like a general location. If somebody was traveling from east to west, north to south, they were moving from here 20 miles over to here, you could answer those questions. Right. That you could go to court and use. But can you say somebody's in an apartment 1F on Cermak in downtown Chicago? The answer is no. But that's exactly what they're using it for. They're saying, I often hear law enforcement say, well, there's a high likelihood or the high probability that the person was at this location based on the cell phone tower record. I just had one, just a case this a little bit ago, where a guy got accused of trying to kidnap a girl. Right. And they said, based on the cell phone records, he was in this area. Actually, I was able to say from the cell phone records, the tower he's using just prior to that and the tower he's using after that, if you take the distance between the two, if you take the RF propagation map and you measure the distance between the furthest signal reach of both those and drive between, he would have had to drive from one to the other directly with no stops whatsoever, because at the time he got, the girl said he was trying to throw her in the back of the car. He was actually, I got him on video checking in his workplace at a hospital. So we said, and based on the location, they said it would have happened unless he was driving George Jetson's car. It couldn't have happened. But right. When you single out one specific ping off one tower at one time, yes, he could have been driving by. But there's no way he could have diverted to the area they were at based on the distance and speed and calculations. There's just no way. It wasn't possible. And then when the girl gets challenged with that in the witness stand, she goes, yeah, well, the guy who did this to me had a full beard. He walked in on video in his workplace with no beard whatsoever. So that, and in a whole different set of clothes than what she said he was wearing, and he was about 4 inches off on height. So clearly the person that got fingered for this off of Facebook wasn't the person who did it, but the prosecution wasn't going to back down because they had this cell phone data, and it told them exactly where he was at. And he must have been the suspect because he was in the middle of a cell phone area that covered 10 square miles, and there couldn't have not been another 6'2" black guy there.
Right. Yeah, and that's the problem that I even see when you counter. You know, when you show the flaws and you show the holes and you show how things just aren't accurate. Unfortunately, a lot of these prosecutors, they just don't give up. They'll keep going with it, and they'll try to talk around it, and that's the problem. I mean, you figure anybody with common sense, I don't know. My philosophy is this: if you believe maybe you did make a mistake and you have the wrong guy, wouldn't you want to only get the right guy? I mean, isn't that the job, to prosecute, somebody who is legitimately guilty, not somebody who's innocent? But it seems like ego is a dangerous thing, and they'll just keep going on that path, regardless of what the evidence is telling them.
We got a big problem in our industry, and I think we'll reserve it for another podcast, but you have a big problem because our industry is supposed to be rooted in science. Science wins every time. But unfortunately, there's this huge divide that law enforcement's created between what they call the law enforcement science and everybody else. So basically, the word on the street is, if you're not law enforcement doing this type of work, you must be lying. Right. Well, you don't do that to the guy processing DNA at the third-party laboratory the state uses. They don't go to him and say, you must be lying because that's not the guy we wanted it to be. That doesn't work. Nope. But somehow in forensics, you have training schools and they're law enforcement only. You have software that's sold to only law enforcement. You have software vendors that are being told by the DEA that if they sell to anybody but law enforcement, they'll cut all their contracts. Well, if you're looking for the truth in the matter, there's only one truth. So why does it matter who does it?
Exactly. It almost shows that, the agendas of flooding, and that's the problem. That and I don't like to assume the worst, but that just leads you to believe that they're really not looking for the truth when those type of things happen. Because like you said, who cares who's doing the testing? Who cares who's doing the analysis? You just want the most qualified individual. And if you're not going down that route, there's a problem.
I view it like this. I even view there's a couple states where law enforcement really pushed on the state legislators to make it where you had to be a licensed private investigator to do computer forensics, which makes absolutely no sense. So you're telling me, as a computer forensic professional, I have to go work for a PI firm that most likely is not doing forensics for 3 years, then stand before a board of my peers, get licensed as a PI, and then I'm allowed to do that type of work. Or the alternative is I'm former law enforcement. See the difference? So now I've got a former law enforcement officer that's been indoctrinated and probably biased, maybe biased, let's put it that way, in everything they do a little bit towards law enforcement, that is now doing my criminal defense case and may not be the most qualified person to do it, but because of the law in that state, I have to hire them. I can't hire anybody else.
That's incredible.
So that makes no sense whatsoever because there's no requirement for the guy doing DNA. There's no requirement.
It's actually just shifting
former law enforcement or a PI.
Yeah, it's actually just shifting it where it's stacking the deck in one-sided favor. I mean, and it's amazing that people don't see this, and I'm sure people aren't even aware of these type of things. That's the problem,
It is, and I've been beating the drum for a while now. I've had the conversations with the DOJ. Some of the senior leadership had no idea some of this is going on. They shaking their head. They're like, this is not possible. And I'm like, this injects bias into the system. We are supposed to be scientists. We're supposed to look at the data. We're supposed to report on the data, not have any bias whatsoever. And then you get these cases now where sometimes the courts are saying, well, Mr. Defense Expert, you couldn't possibly be an expert and defend this case because you've never been to this training school. Well, guess what? The training school is only offered to law enforcement. Right. So how could you be to that school? So But that training school is based off of a science, and if the science is not peer reviewed by the entire community, not just law enforcement community, then it's subject for Daubert or Fry. Throw it out. Right. It's a junk science. It's got to be generally accepted by your peers and the entire community. And it doesn't have to be entire community. That's not actually in the law. It says the community. But you can't single out and say, I'm only going to have law enforcement test law enforcement software and nobody else, right?
Right.
Of course, you know what the results are going to be.
Yeah, we can predict those cases every time.
Yes, that's the easy situation. Now, there are situations where there are law enforcement only schools. If they're talking about tactics and procedures that are law enforcement sensitive, or you're talking about classified data and things like that with the DOD. There's reasons for those schools, right? But that doesn't mean that somebody can't the court can't authorize somebody else to another expert to dig into the data, test the data, and come to the same conclusions. Because us as forensic experts have one job. Our job is to analyze the same data that law enforcement analyzed, maybe analyze more if we can get access to more of it because it's our client. Analyze that same data using the same methodology, same procedures, and see if we come up with the same result. We come up with the same opinion.
Right.
If it's different, then that's where you challenge their expert in court. If it's the same, then you've just validated their result.
Right. And that's actually my gripe, so to speak, is that there's no problem with those things. There's no problem if you want to have the law enforcement training, because I have no problem with any of that. Where I have a problem is then when they exclude anything that doesn't fit into that one umbrella. That's the problem, when they try to make it that it could only fit into that one puzzle, and if they're not doing it and they're not completing it, then it can't be counted and you can't be utilized. That's really where the problem is, and that's where the disconnect is. And what's bothersome is, jurors just aren't aware of these things. They don't understand what goes into these things, and when they see the experts get on the stand for the prosecution side, they're just enamored. And we just had a case now. You could tell every juror, everything that came out of the expert's mouth on the government's end, it was like gospel to the juror. And if it goes unchallenged, that's a huge problem. That's a huge blow to the defense. Huge blow.
Well, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Let me read to you from U.S. versus Antonio Evans, and that's case 10 CR 747 TAC 3. That's Judge Lefkoe in the Northern District in the Eastern Division of Illinois. It says the court agrees that using Google Maps to plot these locations does not require scientific, technical, or other specialized knowledge, and that these exhibits are admissible through lay opinion testimony under Rule 701. That's because they wanted to inject some maps showing where the cell phone towers were at. That's fine. Then it goes on to say Special Agent Ratchey may not testify concerning the theory of granulization, which the court finds to be unreliable. In addition, the estimated coverage areas contained in Summary Exhibit 6 must be removed before the court will admit this exhibit. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Some courts are wisening up. And it used to be that you could get away with this stuff because nobody challenged you. Think about it. If you went in unopposed, you win.
That's right.
You can say whatever you want.
That's right.
Those days are over.
Yep.
So,
well, hopefully that's a little start of a tide. And, what I talk about a lot on the podcast is, unfortunately, it boils down to the individual. It boils down to the judge that you have, what they're going to allow in, how much leeway they're going to get. If they truly are unbiased, if they are biased, and that's the problem. That's what it boils down to, and that's what I see a lot of defendants, unfortunately, getting hit with, where they can't put on the case that they want to put on because during the pretrial and the motions they're submitting, they're getting denied a lot, and they're not allowed to ask certain questions, they're not allowed to analyze certain information, they're not allowed to challenge, and that's really what the problem is, and that's the disconnect, and that's why I just harp on the importance of having an expert such as yourself and such as your firm, where you need the defense to just show the other side of these things, because if they get on and they just paint it one way, it's devastating to any case. It's just devastating.
It is. It's the jury shakes their head the whole time and they believe it. And then when we start talking, we start throwing out things like, somebody on this juror, I'm sure, lives in this area. Who's to know that they didn't do it? No. The mayor lives there. The police commissioner lives there. Are they now suspects too because they live in this cone? It's just it's absurd. And over again, I've even challenged the very people that wrote books on how to do this stuff. I've had them in a case where they had to concede that they can't tell you where the person was at. They just know they're in some 20-mile circle, maybe. They don't even know that because, as it says, this radio frequency propagation, it changes over time. Antennas are tuned and changed and altered, and if you don't test it right afterwards, you're not going to get a perfect, accurate reading, but you may get an estimation. So the whole answer is I can give you an estimation, but I surely can't put somebody on a street corner or in a crime scene. It's not even possible with CDR records. I can tell you that they're in the same town. They're on the northeast side of the town. That's about it.
Gotcha. And how, from your experience, is do you get a situation where it could actually bounce off another tower? Is there any reasoning, the weather, I don't know how it would work, where it could affect the signal, where maybe it pinged off a tower where they're really not that close to that tower? It's not the closest tower to where their physical location is, but it pinged off of that tower. Does that ever come up?
Distance to tower has nothing to do with whether or not you're using that tower. There are so many other factors. Now, you've got environmental factors, like you're standing on the backside of a metal building, right? And there's obstructions in the way. There's weather issues. Take out all that stuff because that's really hard to kind of calculate. The whole idea is this is a cell phone tower. Let's say a cell phone tower only holds 60 phone calls. What if you're number 61? You can't make a call on that tower. It's going to let you use the tower next to it. Or there's trunking issues. So in other words, the tower says, I'm going to hand you off from this tower to the next tower because we think you're closer over there. And then you start getting close to the other tower, and it says, nah, I'm just going to hold on to your call for a little bit, but I'm going to trunk it over as soon as you get really, really far away. So you may be, and then you've got towers like what we call super towers, which is a tower that has a really big broadcast range, and you got a bunch of little towers within that tower. You could be using either one. You could be using the big tower, or you could be using the little tower. They're both aimed in the same direction.
And now when that takes place, how far of a radius does it open up to where you could actually be located in reference to that tower that it moved you to?
Regardless, there's going to be an RF propagation footprint. And you're basically going to say, based on this phone call, you were somewhere in this footprint. If you were on that tower, there's a footprint for the tower, a big, giant, huge, like, egg-shaped looking circle thing, and crazy outer little legs coming off of it, so it isn't a perfect cone or a perfect circle or a perfect egg. It's this weird looking, it's the radio frequency propagation map, but you're somewhere in that radio frequency footprint if you're using that tower. There has been some situations, and it's very rare, that towers have been banded together, so you actually have two towers acting as one. They have the same tower number. Because remember, the tower number has to do with billing, okay?
Right.
And it has to do with that type of stuff. So sometimes your phone can connect to two different towers, but they're named the same. Super rare, only happens temporarily, and that's something usually it happens when they stand up a brand new tower that's going to replace an old tower. They leave them both running.
Gotcha.
But it's happened.
Right.
But the whole idea is we can draw on a map with RF propagation and show you what tower you're using. But if there's other towers that broadcast in the area and they say, well, now you're using this other tower and the other tower, you could be standing still the whole entire time. You didn't even have to be moving.
Wow.
You could ping off multiple towers standing in the same place.
And what kind of radius would you say each tower has? Is there a general basis for that, or does it fluctuate?
It depends on what type of tower, what type of technology they're using, what kind of antennas they're using, and then what kind of the height of the tower, those things. There's a website, Spectre site, American Tower is one of the companies that own a lot of towers in the United States. They actually publish that data. You can go on there, and it won't tell you the RF footprint, but it'll tell you like the height of the tower, the type of antenna that's strapped to it, those type of things.
Gotcha.
Which doesn't really necessarily help you determine the footprint because they could turn the power down on the thing. You never know.
Right.
It could be full power or half power, those type of things. But in general, most towers can broadcast anywhere from a mile to 20 miles.
Gotcha.
20 miles is a large geographic area. So to get an idea, when the police, let's say, have a murder and they have a lost body in the woods, hypothetically, to cover every square foot with a dog of a 1 mile square, it takes 40 people 48 hours.
Yeah, so that'll give you a visual of how large that actually is. Yep.
20 miles is going to take a lot of locations you can be at. If you took a 20-mile ring, you could literally put a city with 100,000 people in it. Now you got 100,000 people as suspects, and you know how many locations those 100,000 people could be in, from everything from Walmart to the bathroom at the grocery store.
Right.
I mean, it could be anywhere.
Yeah, well, even when when you get like in the suburbs and that kind of area, you have towns that are right next to each other, so you could have somebody in a completely different town. I mean, that's what's so dangerous, and they don't explain those type of things. They make it that no, this is exactly where he was, this is how he was traveling or she was traveling, and the problem is if it's not opposed, that's what the jurors digest, and that's what really hit home for them, and that's what they make their decisions based on. And I've seen it play out. It's frustrating when you're sitting there and you know a little bit about it. I can only imagine what you go through when you're hearing some of these quote-unquote experts speak, and it's not accurate.
I used to hear them speak, but I tend to now, every case I've showed up to the past about 4 years, they refuse to testify. I showed up and they left.
Well, that means you're doing
'cause
something
now-
right. You're doing something right if that's the case.
I always say this is, if you have a defense expert, the prosecution didn't have the right expert on their end. Because if their experts did their job, there would be no defense expert.
That's a great way of putting it. That's right.
So the more you see a prosecutor's expert in the witness stand, you know that they're not doing the right work.
Right.
That's the way I look at it. Because if there was an ironclad report, it wouldn't do it. Because us experts are not in the business of finding technical I gotchas, get out of jail free cards, right? I mean, that's not what we do.
No, of course
because
not.
it's not going to help you in front of a jury. It just isn't. It's not going to help you at a bench trial.
No, it just
It's
takes
gonna
away
be-
your credibility. I mean, if you're doing that.
Yeah,
way,
they're going to look at you like, it's kind of like, oh, there's a virus in the computer excuse. It's not going to work.
Right.
You need to have it rooted in science. But if you say, hey, you put him there, but I'm telling you, I can place him also 25 miles from the same place, and you can't tell the difference. That's a big deal.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, that's a big deal. They're saying this person was in this neighborhood, and I'm saying, no, how about they were in that city?
Right. Right.
And then they go, well, that is. Then they ask you the question, isn't that neighborhood within the city? Well, yes, it is.
Right.
But so is 7,000 other businesses and 150,000 residents, right? I mean,
Right.
You can't. And you get those goofy questions like, isn't that in here? Isn't that in here? And I says, yes, including this very courtroom, including the mayor's house, commissioner's house, and everything. I could, this suspect could have been anywhere.
Yeah.
He could have been at church. You can't tell the difference. Just because it's kind of like saying I have a bunch of apples, and just because one's bad in the middle, I can't tell which one's what. I'm just going to say they're all bad.
Right.
It doesn't work.
Right. Doesn't work that way. Well, I tell you, Andrew, this was very informative, and we're going to be doing a few calls because you have a lot of different topics that I think we could enlighten the listeners on because, that's the purpose of what I'm trying to do here is just trying to educate the public and open their eyes to what really takes place and basis behind these things, not just make claims without supporting it, but just it's as we were touching on earlier, it's not a matter of just trying to say, well, our side's right or this is right. That's not what it's about. It's just showing the facts, showing actual accounts, showing how things actually work, and going from there, not trying to look at it with an agenda or look at it from one set of eyes.
I don't want to scare people off in thinking that this is not affordable. I think any of these cases, when you get cell phone data, regardless of expert, I mean, you can always call our office. We'll love to work with you. But if you don't, call any expert, call your office, and have the data analyzed. You're talking a couple hours consulting time, less than $1,000. You're done analyzing all the data, and then they're going to tell you whether or not you're going to bear fruit from continuing down that mission. If they do tell you, hey, this is good because we can place the suspect somewhere else, or we can put a huge gap in time between these things, and they could have been anywhere, they could have drove 10 miles over, those type of things. They'll discuss that with you, and they'll talk to you about it, and then they'll give you a cost on doing everything else. But a lot of these cases now, you don't have to testify. If a defense expert writes a really good report and it's shared with the prosecutor, a lot of times the prosecutor will concede. They'll say, we're not going to use that data. And the reason they do is they often go back to their detective, and their detectives read the defense expert report, and go, this guy knows more than I do. This guy clearly can talk to a jury and has a lot of technical experience that I don't even understand what he's talking about because I've never seen any of this stuff. I've never been part of the FCC licensing. I've never looked at engineering specifications. And it doesn't have to get technical. All the technical mumbo-jumbo we attach to the back of the report, and we just reference it, right?
Right.
But it scares the prosecutors. Prosecutors are really scared to get into that because then it detracts from them, usually the rest of their data, right, the rest of the evidence in the case. Because now they're derailed on this one thing that the jury's kind of shaking their head and looking at the prosecutor like, what are you doing here? This doesn't seem right. And then everything else they have, they lose their trust and credibility in. So what we tend to do is if you do your analysis up front and you write your client a really good letter that could be shared, you could possibly avoid having an expert come to trial.
Right, and honestly, somebody's life's on the line, so it's really important to at least do that initial step. And like I said, the initial step is very cost effective and it's not expensive. It's just a matter of making sure whether or not you have something there or you don't, and it's just vital for that. And what would be the best way any of our listeners to really contact your firm? Andrew, what's the best way to do that? Through the website, through the email? What would you say is the best way for that?
You can always call. If you go to GarrettDiscovery.com, that's GarrettDiscovery.com, if you go to our contact section, there's different offices throughout the United States you can call. And or you can call our 800 number, which is 888-822-5077. That's 888-822-5077. And they'll direct you to the right office that's closest to you. We have offices throughout the Midwest to the East Coast, and one office in Nairobi, Kenya, that works with a lot of banking clients on internal investigations. Well, we'll be glad to help you. We fly all over. We work in multiple countries and all across the United States, coast to coast. Most of our experts are on a plane, 10 to 14 days a month they're traveling, going to trials and testifying. I personally have testified, hundreds of times.
Right.
And it's I think the last count was 212 or something like that, I think. But we testify not only in this, we work in audio, mobile, video, forensics. You and I have worked together in cases before.
Absolutely. Yep. And I've spoke about the different things we've touched on, and again, they could always just contact me, and I'll put them in touch with you. So either way, I mean, it's very important that they have a conversation. I mean, just because these things are just so important, and they can impact the case so dramatically. I've seen it play out, unfortunately, and if you don't have that opposition, it really is. It could go south very quickly. And that's why I try to just stress these things to the listeners. It's not even so much as a matter of, well, they're wrong, they're assuming. It's just a matter of getting to the facts. That's all. You just want to make sure whatever discovery you get, whatever information, whatever claims that are being made by the state or the government or the prosecution is accurate. That's all. And if it's not accurate, you have a right to expose that and show the truth.
Absolutely. And, we're a different type of firm because we do take training very serious for other experts. So if you already have an expert, if somebody listening to this has an expert they work with, keep working with them if you want. That's fine. Call us in. We'll be glad to train them while we're there. We'll come in, we'll help you, and we'll train the local guy we're at it because he might as well learn something while we're at it. And there's times other experts have taught us things. So we are more than friendly to everybody. We view nobody as competitors. We view them as colleagues.
Yep.
Anytime, and it's the same thing like when you and I met. We said, let's work together. Let's do some cases together. And it's one of those things that we're very, very open. We're very transparent, and we're not one of those people that play, hold our cards close to our chest or anything like that. We're talking about, we're scientists, but we like educating too. So we were more than willing to come in and educate some people.
And I think what we always had in common is just that we just want to help whoever we're working with, whoever we're trying to defend. We just want to make sure they're getting the best defense possible. And that's really what it's about. It's just trying to allow that to happen,
Absolutely. I always say this is, if your expert is all technical, it's a bad day for you. If your expert is a quarter strategist, quarter legal scholar, and a 50% forensic expert, you're in a good position because they're going to make sure they should have the knowledge to know how this is going to play out in court, how this is going to work, how you could put your best foot forward, because sometimes they can see the freight train coming down the tracks before you can.
Right.
So one of the things they always say to do is strategy first. So there are cases that this is really good to use in, and then there's cases that this is horrible, because the knife does cut both ways. Even though you may be able to say, I want all the CDR data, if it places your client at the scene, that's the problem. But there's other data. When we're talking about this call detail records, there's other data if you want to place somebody somewhere else. You've got cell phone data from the cell phones. It's actually imaged the cell phone. I can pull out all the GPS locations. I can pull the GPS locations out of their pictures, out of their Instagram, Facebook account. Those type of things all have location data in them. And Google now has what people are calling reverse warranting. They have the ability not only to tell you where your phone was at, they could tell you who was standing next to you. So you can subpoena that type of data. So if you want to place somebody somewhere else and you know the phone was somewhere else besides where they're saying it was at, call us. We'll work with you because there's a lot of other sets of data. The problem with a lot of this other data is it's for law enforcement, they don't want to get it. If they've got CDR data and it places you at the scene, they can say, hey, you were close. We know you were within the cell phone coverage. They don't want to look anywhere else because if they did and it said you were somewhere else, it shoots their theory.
That's right.
You know,
That's right. They just want to have together, what they need for their case, and that's why it's so important to explore these other options.
Absolutely. Yeah. Explore, because it's just a subpoena, right?
Yeah.
It's a subpoena, a couple hours worth of work for an expert to look at. If an expert's telling you 10, 20 grand, don't hire him. You should be able to analyze this data in a couple hours and be able to tell you, especially if you say, I'm only looking at one specific date and time or a couple hours. They should be able to answer those questions quickly. Now, if you have 3 months worth of data and it's a 3-month travel plans, you're going to get a larger bill because it's going to take some time to analyze it.
Absolutely.
But if you're just looking at a small section of time, you should be able to get away with, $1,000, $1,200, have this done.
Yeah, and it'll just give you direction, if nothing else. Give you direction of what you're looking at and where you could go from there. So it's very important.
There's only one truth. That's our answer in our office every day. We got it hanging on the wall. It says there's only one truth. There's not multiple truths. So the answer is we're seeking the one truth. So there's only one version of the story.
Yep, I like that. Well, again, Andrew, I really appreciate your time, and we're going to, we discussed, I know we're going to, I'll let the listeners know of any other topics we're going to be rolling out, but we have a lot of things we could dive into to just further educate and just enhance, the knowledge base, and hopefully we get a few potential jurors as listeners where when they're on a case, they'll remember some of what was said throughout these podcasts will sink in and just open their minds a little bit so that they're not, falling for any facades or smoke and mirrors. That's really what it's all about.
I agree. Yep. I appreciate you having me on today.
No, I appreciate your time, and thanks for calling in, and we'll speak soon.
All right. Thanks. You have a great day.
You too. And that was Andrew Garrett. I believe it was a very informative and interesting podcast today. And like I said, we're going to have other topics we're going to cover. I'm going to look to get different experts from his office on with their area of expertise. And it's just it all goes back to what the basis of the podcast is all about. It's just about informing the public, getting them to understand what's going on, defendants to possibly know their options, to strategize, helping defense teams, and just trying to help fix what sometimes, unfortunately, is a broken system. When you're dealing with bias and you're dealing with people who have a target and you deal with agendas, you're really fighting an uphill battle. So you have to have the tools available to you to give you the best fighting chance and to counteract a severe opponent. You have an opponent like I've touched on with sometimes endless money, endless funds, and endless time. There's really nothing more dangerous than that. So I want to hopefully give our listeners the tools to prepare for that and do the best they can to make sure they get a fair case with the strongest defense team and the strongest strategies possible. And thanks for listening to this episode. And this is Justice Tech Pros. Talk to you next time.